Who are you?
You heard of the USS Lawton? Neither did the public. Out of 1,000 young men on that ship, I was the only survivor. They told my family she was sunk in battle, but I know what I saw. It had no conscience. No reasoning, just destroy. I spent the last 30 years trying to prove the truth of what I learned that day. This planet doesn't belong to us. Ancient species owned this Earth long before mankind, and if we keep our heads buried in the sand, they will take it back.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me, as always, is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
All right, so we're picking up where we last left off with our episode on Gareth Edwards' Godzilla, the first in Legendary Entertainment and Warner Brothers' series of films that has now subsequently been dubbed the Monsterverse, a prospective franchise of tie-in films that are all established around this sort of connected universe of franchise films, all of which are presumably going to involve giant monsters to some extent, but which so far seem to be focused mostly on the characters Godzilla and King Kong. And I wanted to pick up where we last left off because I remember making a big point about, and I wanted to reiterate for this episode, that when I first saw Godzilla, I think it was on opening day back in 2014. I remember I was in college. Me and my friends all went to see it. Like, I was super gung-ho about it, you know, like the rest of my friends, you know, they weren't necessarily huge Godzilla fans. And so for them, it was just kind of another blockbuster movie. But for me, it was like, okay, this is going to be it. This is going to be the big successful attempt at a blockbuster film, like doing like the big budget justice to the kind of big, ingenious and extensive destructive spectacle of a giant monster movie. And I remember distinctly that when the film was over, I viscerally did not like Godzilla. I really found it kind of boring and tedious for the most part. And to a strange extent, despite the fact that I was the most excited of all of my friends going into it, I remember them actually having not a much better opinion, but, you know, they weren't very critical of it, you know, that, you know, I was like, to the point of where I was like, because I was kind of the one who had drummed it up, I was kind of the one who dragged them all to it. And so I was like, I was literally apologizing to them, and I was like, "Oh man, that was a piece of crap. I'm sorry that I dragged you there." And they were like, "No, that was all right. That was pretty cool. I like the part
Yeah,
where
maybe if you lowered your expectations, you would have enjoyed it better.
I don't think it was a matter of too high expectations. It was a matter of my expectations. It's a function of the fact that I had an image of the film in my head, which at the end of the day, I have to admit, is completely divorced from quality. Like, oftentimes when you have a visceral reaction to a film where you see the trailers for it, you see the publicity campaign, and you're really excited for it, and then you go to see the film, it's not even necessarily always a function of the fact that you have too high of an expectation. It's a fact that your expectation is built around all of these abstract images from this publicity campaign that are all now in your head, and they're germinating into both a very vague but a very specific and kind of insular concept of what you think the film is going to be. And then you see the film, and even if the film is not necessarily bad, because it does not comport to that image that you have in your head, you often have a visceral reaction to it. You often say, "Oh, that's not what I paid to see." And with Godzilla, the thing about it is that I did have that initial reaction where I was like, that's just a piece of crap. But then over time, like I said in the last episode, there were still these lingering things about it. There were still aspects of it that still left a very deep impression upon me that I didn't even internalize necessarily as having enjoyed them. I just simply found them interesting. And now I've gone back to the film twice, and each time I have gotten more out of it. And now I actually do enjoy it. And not only do I enjoy it, I consider it a very good film in the context of big budget blockbuster event tentpole films. And it was kind of like what we discussed on that last episode, where it's a function of the fact that it is something intrinsic to Gareth Edwards' approach to the direction of the story and the way it's written, which, you know, I was going into the film with this idea that was not just a function of thinking, oh man, wouldn't it be great if we had like a classic Godzilla movie, a classic monster beat-em-up film, but you just had like a big budget, you had CGI, you had the possibility to do anything you want. But also unconsciously, I was conflating that with everything that I had come to expect from the sort of template of what I had come to expect from a standard American blockbuster tentpole film. I was conflating those things in my mind without even necessarily considering whether that would have been a good thing or not. But then being able to really sit with the film and appreciate it for the ways that it specifically goes against the grain of how a conventional blockbuster film story is told, I started to realize that that is actually the thing that makes it such a evocative film, is the fact that there are still aspects of it, you know, even close to, I mean, not necessarily close to, even 7 years down the line, that you can still look at it and you can still see, man, this is a really ballsy move, the way that they set up the first big fight sequence of the film, but then they don't show the fight sequence. The way so much of the story is told, with the human characters being so passive and so much of the film being about them being powerless and just witnessing these things, and then having the story being told that way. You know, the construction of the film as a kind of contemplative disaster movie rather than as an action film. Already when Godzilla was in release, or was close to being released, you know, Legendary had already announced at the San Diego Comic-Con in July of 2014 that they were already in the works of creating their own King Kong movie that was tentatively called Skull Island. It was originally going to be distributed by Universal, but then a little bit later in the year, they had decided to shift the project over to Warner Brothers, who they had distributed with and co-financed Godzilla with. Later in 2015, Legendary then announced that they basically confirmed that they were not only planning to do a standalone Kong movie, but that they were going to go into the project with the idea of making it kind of a pseudo prequel to Godzilla, that this was going to be the part of their establishing of a expanded universe of giant monster films, and they were announcing that then they're going to team up King Kong and Godzilla. They're going to have Godzilla versus Kong, and all of these pieces are starting to fall into place. So Kong Skull Island comes out in 2017, and like we had said in the last episode, we see the pattern of Hollywood studios picking up directors to helm these projects who aren't necessarily known for big budget action movies. And in this case, Jordan Vogt-Roberts, the director of Kong Skull Island, he was not even known for having done a genre film. His first feature was in 2013. It was a coming-of-age drama called The Kings of Summer. So it wasn't even one of these sort of middle-brow films that blur the line between kind of independent art house cinema and genre films like sci-fi and horror. He really was just, it very much was just this guy who had made this one independent coming-of-age drama who is now behind the seat of this huge spectacle. Like the production budget of the film alone came in at around like $185 million, which is about $25 million more than Godzilla costs. That's, of course, not even incorporating like a distribution, publicity, marketing, and, you know, like that's another thing.
It's another 100 million, right?
Basically, the rule of thumb is that for your average film, your publicity budget and your distribution budget is going to be in total, at the very least, at least one half of your production budget. In the case of Kong Skull Island, the international marketing budget was $136 million. So it was just about 3/4 of the entire production budget. And I remember seeing the film in 2017. Once again, I saw it on opening day, and I remember loving it. And not only do I remember loving Kong Skull Island, but I remember it literally being like my favorite movie of 2017. Like, I would not stop talking about it. But then the exact opposite thing happens that happened with Godzilla, is that the further down the line that I got away from Kong Skull Island, up to the point where I am now watching it again some 3 years later, it's not just that I'm seeing the flaws in the movie, and not just that, like, maybe I have more of a kind of dispassionate view of it. I won't say that I've done like a 180 on the film. I don't think I necessarily even consider it a bad movie in aggregate. There was something to that opening day experience. I think when I first saw it, I was correct that it was a good Saturday night movie. It is basically a movie that is absolutely, if you have seen the trailer for Kong Skull Island, if you were watching the publicity campaign, then you went to see Kong Skull Island in theaters, you not only got exactly what you were being promised, but you virtually got exactly the film that you saw in your head. That weird sort of totally vague but nonetheless specific composite of all of these abstract images that you got from the publicity campaign, but threaded through by your own intuitive understanding of what the basic template of this type of film would be. And so it was a thoroughly, immediately satisfying experience. But now further down the line, it's one of those things where I am more recognizing of the fact that not only are there some genuinely bad aspects of the film just from a narrative and a storytelling perspective, I can't help but be struck by the sheer contrast between Kong Skull Island and Godzilla. Godzilla, obviously it's not a thoroughly original film, but what, Hollywood blockbuster is going to be. But nonetheless, Godzilla was such an idiosyncratic film. It is so much different from your average American blockbuster. And Kong Skull Island is not only not really significantly different from your average American blockbuster in any way, but it's almost so much of a hyper distillation and such an artificial, streamlined, smoothed, cookie cutter Hollywood blockbuster. The artificiality becomes so alienating upon second viewing that now, when I saw the movie when it first came out, I was thoroughly with it throughout the running time. This time, an hour into the movie, I was already like, okay, this is getting tedious. I'm an hour into this movie. There's an hour more to go. I've already seen all of these spectacles the last time I saw it, and now I'm seeing the spectacles again. And unlike the spectacles of Godzilla, I'm not getting anything new out of seeing these spectacles again than the last time I saw it 3 years ago. But I wanted to get your impression, because you've only seen this once.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah. So your first impressions.
It reminds me of not to be racist or anything, but the old saying about a 13-course Chinese dinner. You leave this film hungry.
Well, this is a co-production of a Chinese conglomerate.
It leaves you hungry after you're done. I mean, the idea is it's lacking. I mean, right away I picked on the almost non sequitur dialogue that either went nowhere or was meaningless. aside from that, I wasn't really impressed with the special effects. I thought Peter Jackson's rendition of Kong was so much better. For some reason, it looked crisper. This didn't look quite as crisp. It was good, and it apparently won awards or was nominated for awards for its
It was nominated at the
special
Oscar
effects.
for visual effects.
Yeah, I just didn't like it. It surfeited the senses.
It received the best visual effects Oscar.
There are a couple
so
of things that are like
Yeah.
things like the fact that this thing sneaks up on people twice when it's as big as a building. I mean, some things defy logic, but let's leave logic aside.
Yeah,
the other stuff is really cool.
I mean,
think
there's
some
a
of the stuff
certain
is really
extent.
cool.
There's a certain extent to it that it's very much a cartoony kind of film, and that's the thing. That's what I would say. Where I don't necessarily think that it's less crisp, but it's this thing where I think number one, the thing that needs to be said that for a guy who literally had only directed a low budget coming of age story, going into Kong Skull Island. From a purely technical perspective, from the perspective of just the look of the film and its visual sophistication, I think you need to hand it to vogt-roberts that he knocked it out of the park. The spectacle is there.
Yep.
And I can't even fault the style of the movie because to a certain extent, in contrast to Godzilla, which has its own distinct kind of muted color palette, its use of very high contrast photography to the extent of having some scenes being lit only with one or two small points of light to really accentuate scale and a kind of mystery. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, vogt-roberts has a much more comic book style of filmmaking. Every shot in this movie is super saturated. Every shot has a kind of maximalist punch to it. It's this thing where
if you were to draw comic cells, for example, the scene with the spider it illustrates that the fact that if you were to do individual cells, that's a remarkable scene. I'm not saying that
you could literally take every shot in this film. You could take stills of the shots in this movie, and you could literally make just a comic book out of it.
Yes, you could,
and it would
it
work
almost
perfectly.
Like he took the storybook from color and went right to the film. Every shot was crisp, and you're exactly right. I agree.
But I think what you're getting to as far as that's the weird
there's
thing.
There's no human investment.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the dialogue has a lot to do with that.
Yeah. The dialogue is terrible.
And the other thing is that you need time to develop those kinds of things, which was, by the way, was pulled off better in Monsters.
Yeah.
With less dialogue, which is ad libitum. And yet it felt more realistic. It felt like you had an investment in these characters. Here, less so. Like you said, it's more like a comic book type of feel to it.
And I say comic book in a sort of vague stylistic sense because I don't want to give the impression because there are definitely, if this were to be made into a comic book, there would obviously be more artfully written comic books even.
The bubbles would be more meaningful, I think.
It would be, I think, it would be the same thing. If you were reading Kong Skull Island as a comic book, you would have to be amazed at the art design and the creature design and what vogt-roberts brings to this movie is a commercialist perfectionism to every single shot in the movie that makes it work on its own as something that is perfectly sensually pleasing on a purely visceral level. But if you were to produce it as a comic book, it would achieve the same result. You would read the comic book, you would admire the art, you would admire the aesthetic sophistication of it, but then you would go back to it and be like, oh, this isn't a very good story. I got the effect, I got the sensual effect of it before, now I'm looking for something below the sensual effect. And I think you're right, the use of, it's almost there's no humanity to it.
Yeah, it looks like but I have to admit, it's brilliant in terms of some of the unexpected things that happen, things that you don't expect to happen. People are summarily dispatched forever. Sometimes you don't expect those characters to leave you, and it's quite striking. Then
and I think that
there's a precariousness to it, which has the feel of Godzilla in a way that these characters are at the whim of everything around them. There's no control over anything.
Right.
It's quite amazing. You have two Academy Award winners in this. You know, Samuel Jackson has an Academy Award for Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, John
Brie
Goodman's
Larson
here.
has 2.
Well, Brie Larson didn't have an Academy Award. Oh wait, which did she get
She
nominated?
got one for The Room.
Yeah,
she
for
got
Room.
for
yeah.
Best Actress in a
Not
Room.
The Room, but
Right,
Room.
Room,
Yeah.
exactly.
Not to be confused with the
And
Tommy
then,
Wiseau movie.
and then you had Richard Jenkins was nominated twice for the Water one, and also before that, The Visitor. He was nominated twice.
We've got a stacked
Yeah,
cast
the
here.
stacked
We have
cast.
Tom Hiddleston, who was obviously probably most famous at this time for playing the Loki character in the Avengers and Thor films for Marvel. Samuel L. Jackson,
John C.
John
Reilly.
Goodman, Brie Larson, John C.
I
Riley.
mean, really,
and
really. So the mix of characters, but unfortunately, there's such a lame dialogue, and it just seems
well, none of them are developed, and,
Yeah,
and none
and
of them
that looks
none
like-
of them has an arc.
there's
in
no
the story.
John C. Riley does, but that we know the arc, right?
Right,
Because
but
he starts the movie off, right? So
yeah, I mean, it's this,
I mean,
but
it's
it's this thing
just
where it's like
doesn't work, man. It doesn't work in the time, and you needed more time to develop the characters better to get a feel for.
Well,
them.
here's the thing: you didn't need more time because this is already a 2-hour movie. It's not that you needed more
Well,
time;
you know what I
it's that
mean,
you needed to take the time that you
and use
had
it more effectively.
and use it more effectively. And I think this is what will, because I think I will touch on that one thing you mentioned, which is that you're right. There is one thing that remains really interesting about Vogt-Roberts' movie. There's a kind of ghoulishness
Yes.
to the film, especially in terms of how many of the supporting cast are not only summarily dispatched throughout the film, but in ways that are really sadistic and darkly humorous. And there are twists in the movie where Vogt-Roberts will play on your expectations
Right.
of, like, particularly how a character might have a heroic moment, like during the climax of the film, and how he will not only take the heroic moment away, it's not taking the heroic moment away so that you'll be more horrified, it's taking it away so that you'll laugh. There is a deeply dark comic edge
Yes,
to the
there is
film
some
that is
yes.
inviting you to kind of laugh at these puny humans and, you know, and take a kind of ghoulish delight
Yep.
in all of the horrible ways that they can die.
There's also, and he went through, there's also, I just jotted down a couple things I remember from the film, just the general symbolism. For example, Athena, the ship, which is the goddess of war, right?
Yeah, the ship that they go on.
Right, and then
Athena,
you
yeah.
have Godzilla in chains,
Kong in chains.
Kong in chains, right?
Yeah.
He has to break through the chains, and it's
During the
reminiscent-
during the
I mean, it's
climax
cool.
of the during
There
the
are
climax of the
some-
film, he
yeah.
has a big fight with the big bad monster of the movie.
skull lizards, whatever
the
they're
skull
called.
crawler,
Skull
the
crawlers.
big skull crawler.
Right.
He is having a fight with it, and he is temporarily thrown back onto some capsized ships, and he gets tangled up in the chains of the ships.
Right.
And obviously, those are all connected to the imagery of previous Kong movies. But in this movie, not only does he break the chains, but he uses the chains as a weapon.
Right.
Yeah. And that's again, it's like, again, there is a kind of ingeniousness to
is.
the
There's a
spectacle
lot
of the
of
film
it.
because
Yeah.
it becomes this weird thing where it's like, and again, this is one of these things that when you are thinking of a movie in your head, when you are idealizing this abstract action movie in your head, Vogt-Roberts will take the spectacle to a direction that you didn't even think that a Hollywood blockbuster would go for fear that it wouldn't be taken seriously. So in Kong Skull Island, you literally have this image where suddenly it's almost like a Hong Kong action movie where Kong now has like the propeller of this ship on the end of chains, and he's like throwing it in slow motion like he's doing like a kung fu or a wuxia,
right,
like
using-
a Chinese opera move
Right.
at this other monster. So suddenly it becomes like a martial arts battle, and it's like
yeah.
there are things to appreciate about the film.
Yeah.
But as I think we're going to get into, there are just basic questions, not only about the dialogue, because I think the fact that the dialogue isn't there is a bit obvious, and I do have some clips that I have isolated of some of the worst offending dialogue from the movie so that we can really kind of pick apart why it doesn't work and why it feels so artificial and kind of alienating, but even just in terms of the structure of the story. So the first thing I want to let's actually.
Well, the idea is the other thing one thing I wanted to point out that, and I can see this when you think about people in these, individuals in this situation, I can see where the dialogue isn't so pithy or it doesn't work. You're just looking for something to say to somebody, and it may be totally stupid, but
Right.
I mean, these are people that don't know when they're going to live or die. I mean,
But
you know,
these
they
people,
just,
but this is the thing. These characters aren't saying things just so that they can communicate with each other. And this is the thing. These characters are saying things because I feel like, for as much as vogt-roberts really does kind of like push the boundaries of absurdity, in other ways, he and the multiple screenwriters of this film, to the same degree that they are willing to push certain boundaries, they also like ruthlessly pander to the intelligence of the audience, which is to the extent that these characters aren't talking because they're in an impossible, incredible situation and they just need to relate to one another. They're talking because the filmmakers feel like they need to throw dialogue into the story, or else like the audience is going to like, I don't know. Like, I think they're just putting dialogue in to have dialogue in. Let's just go with a first scene of really bad offending dialogue. This comes from 6 minutes into the film, so we're right at the beginning. So John Goodman is the head of a small secret organization, a sort of apparently a branch of the State Department called Monarch. Now, Monarch is obviously the secret organization from Godzilla. This film is taking place in 1973.
So it's a prequel.
So it's a prequel, and it's
right.
taking place at the very end of the Vietnam War. And John Goodman is going to this guy he knows in order to basically beg for funding so that he can go on an expedition to this island called Skull Island. So here's a clip from that scene.
It's notorious for the number of ships and planes that have gone missing there.
Like the Bermuda Triangle. Or like that aluminum foil hat that I like to wear on the weekends.
It's more like the triangle than the hat, but we like to think it's much more than that.
Okay.
Right.
So,
right.
so
that's right. Very hammy. Very terrible.
Well, but here's the thing. Like, it wasn't even necessarily hammy because they're doing this kind of deadpan. I forget who the actor is who is playing like the guy at the FBI.
Yeah, the guy. It's.
I know him. He's like a big character.
Richard
actor.
Jenkins.
Yeah, Richard Jenkins.
Right.
He's this big.
He's Senator Willis.
Yeah, Senator Willis. So
right.
like, yeah, So he says it's like, oh, it's like the Bermuda Triangle, or like the tinfoil hat that I wear on the weekends, and it's like. No, those things don't connect at all.
No, they don't.
Like, why would you even bring it up? Like, it's like you already stated.
He could have said better. Like the way my son believes in,
or Atlantis.
UFOs, or
but like it seems it's one of those things where it's like, so like, what is even the point of him saying that line?
Know, it's a wasted scene.
But here's the thing: is like, here's the thing: we know what the point of him saying that line, rather than him saying like the Bermuda Triangle. The point is that this is the screenwriters of the film attempting to do comedy.
Oh, I don't know
that they're making. No, it's explicitly a joke. The senator Richard Jenkins, he makes a joke basically saying that John Goodman is a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist. Now, that may be true, and it may be true about the relationship between the characters. But here's the thing. Saying tinfoil hat in that sequence of lines, number one, it doesn't make sense in context, because it's like, this is like this. It's a joke that he's making at John Goodman's expense, and then you have John Goodman responding with the kind of deadpan answer of, well, it's a little bit more like the Bermuda Triangle than the hat.
Right.
And it's just like, okay, so now you're doubling down on the joke, and it sort of reinforces the kind of unnaturalism of it. Like, This is not something that anybody would say except in the mind of a room full of screenwriters who are all trying to do comedy, but none of these screenwriters do comedy. Every time that I have like an audio commentary for one of these movies, I try to listen to the audio commentary just to get inside the head of the filmmakers, or even if it's a scholar commenting on the movie, which is what I've usually had to do for like older films that we watch, because a lot of times the people who made these films have died by the time that they record the audio commentary. But I was listening to the audio commentary by Jordan Vogt-Roberts, and as he's talking about this scene, he talks about how he really likes that he got Richard Jenkins in this scene because he and John Goodman are good deadpan comedic character actors. So he makes it is clear that the point of this scene is supposed to be slightly sort of quirky and humorous. But then the weird thing is that he, as a filmmaker, is saying it's like, it's one of those things where it's like when people are going into this movie, I don't think they know that, it's okay to laugh at the absurdity of this situation. It's okay to, see that something is very weird is going on. And they're not supposed to be taking this film overly seriously, that it's okay to see these characters in this room, John Goodman begging for money so that he can go and research the island, and that the audience should know that it's okay to laugh at these things because they're not used to having this kind of ironic distance between themselves and the spectacle they're watching.
And this is another scene that I think is much funnier than you sort of understand at first go. And there are a lot of people who come into this movie and are unsure of whether they're allowed to laugh, whether it can be funny. But it is funny when you first show it to people, because they certainly are not sure if the movie is trying to be funny or trying to be weird or not.
Here's the thing.
I mean, anybody could have written something better for that. Come on.
No, here's the thing. It's not just an excuse, but it's not just an excuse. It's just patently delusional.
Yes.
Like
they're so invested in it that they'll double down on it.
Well, it's not even that if they're so invested. It's that nothing that is in the context of the modern American action blockbuster, there is nothing that is going on in this scene that is even the slightest bit odd or quirky or out of the ordinary. We have seen this scene a million times. We've seen it in various X-Men or Avengers movies. There is always a scene of people in offices discussing some weird goings-on. All of the people involved in the creation of this movie really overjudged just how odd the movie Kong Skull Island is. Not just how odd the premise of it is, but how quirky and weird they were getting with it. American audiences are thoroughly used to big budget special effects films that don't really have any grounding in any kind of physical realism. We watch movies with superheroes and big apocalyptic events. We see these things all the time. So just making that scene and putting dry, deadpan humor into it is not doing anything special. And I think it goes even further in that the kind of ironic distanciation that Vogt-Roberts is going for, even that is really not uncommon in American blockbuster films. I think it's even the problem with a lot of American blockbuster films, and why Godzilla, for comparison's sake, is so kind of unique and ingenious, where Godzilla really doesn't have a lot of gags. There isn't a lot of irony in Godzilla. It really is almost to its fault, a kind of earnest and contemplative and passive and slow movie. Whereas what we're used to is constant deadpan quipping from Robert Downey Jr. and Tom Holland and all of these other actors making quippy jokes.
I'm always picking up after you guys.
Yeah, exactly. In the midst of all of this apocalyptic spectacle, no matter how many people are dying, no matter how much this ridiculous stuff, it is the attitude du jour in American popular culture to just shrug these things off and say, it's not really that special. Isn't this all kind of stupid? And so I think this is really a kind of sense of cognitive dissonance that carries throughout Kong Skull Island.
It is all throughout.
It's a film that thinks that it is more original than it is, and it is also a film that thinks that it's funnier than it is, which is a real problem, especially if you've got a room full of screenwriters, people like Dan Gilroy, Max Borenstein, Derek Connolly, all of these people who are, it cannot be stressed, they are not comedy writers. These people have a very specific thing that they are, I guess, that you can say that they are generally good at. They are good at getting into writers' rooms and making cobbled together, streamlined action and thriller screenplays for big budget special effects films that don't have a lot of unique stuff going on in them. Obviously, he gets the approval. There's already a scientific expedition that is going to Skull Island. Not a secret organization scientific expedition. It's just a regular scientific expedition that is going to the island. John C. Reilly is able to get approval to piggyback off of this expedition with his own scientific team, and he also gets a military escort
right.
to
Military
go
escort.
with them. This is where we get introduced to Samuel L. Jackson as this embittered U.S. Army lieutenant. He feels like he has been betrayed in terms of how much time and how many lives have been invested by the U.S. Armed Forces in this struggle in South Vietnam, and how now they are basically giving up for what he believes is basically just the result of the United States press and the activist press undermining morale in the project.
But it's more deep than that. I think he's the emblem of many soldiers, and you saw this in you saw this in other movies where without war, these people are totally out of place, and they have no future. And it was supposed to embody a little bit of that, and you see that in the Liam Wiggins character in a way. He's so detached that all they know is the brutality of war, and it's a demoralizing war. But it's so superficially. I mean, they bring all the music in and stuff like that, but it really misses the point, right? So
it's like when we're and this is the thing. So once we're introduced to John Goodman and his sidekick, his scientific team, we then
Corey Hawkins
we're
as
then Corey Hawkins as his assistant. This fresh out of graduate school, this guy who just joined
Easton
this
Brooks.
organization.
Right.
He wrote a thesis on hollow Earth theory, and now it's one of those things where he was sort of drummed out of the academy for proposing hollow Earth theory. John Goodman is the only one who buys into it because John Goodman himself believes that they're giant monsters living in these hollow channels of the earth. And of course, Houston thinks that in and of itself is crazy. But so we are introduced to them, and then we are going to be introduced to all of our other major characters, this ensemble cast. And so we're introduced to Samuel L. Jackson and his ragtag crew of Army guys.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really just kind of typical. It's
There's
this and obviously it's one of those things where it's like we're introduced to them like they're in this airbase hangar. Everybody is packing
like the
up
A-team.
Everyone.
Reminiscent
Well,
in
the
a way?
rest of the army is packing up and leaving on their
Right.
helicopters back to the United States and their planes back to the United States. And all of Samuel Jackson's team are just palling around and making bawdy jokes with each other and talking about ha ha ha. Aren't we such detached, manly men, aren't we? And isn't this manly camaraderie we have? And also the other thing that cannot be understated here is that this is also where we start with just the incessant use of almost every late 60s, early 70s psych rock hit that you have heard a million times before, and used in a way that is so completely obvious and used in such short sequence, one after the other, that it becomes distracting. So it begins with Time Has Come Today from the Chamber Brothers. We're also going to hear White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. That's when we're introduced to Tom Hiddleston's character, because you see John Goodman and his pal. They go into this pool hall and this brothel where Tom Hiddleston is playing pool, and they basically recruit him because he's this
Captain James Conrad,
which is of course Conrad being an obvious reference to Joseph Conrad, the author of Heart of Darkness. The movie is the references here are not subtle. Unfortunately, this is a film that has a lot of references, but not a lot of actual like a kind of substantive or evocative attention to what the works that it's referencing are about. But basically, we're introduced to Tom Hiddleston's character. He's this he's an ex-British Special Air Service captain who has now specialized in basically leading he's a hunter tracker who leads expeditions. They recruit him basically as, it's one of these, you're the best of the best scenes. I want you to do one last job job. We're going to pay you a bunch of money just to make sure if anything goes tits up that we can find our way back to civilization from uncharted territory.
Right.
So we're introduced to him. And of course, White Rabbit is playing. Why White Rabbit would be playing in a bar, in a Vietnamese bar, as opposed, and this is the
they
thing,
play
just
American music in the Vietnamese
they
one.
play American music, but like again,
Because it's a brothel, right?
But here's the thing: this could have been a perfect moment for them to do some like actual research, like into music.
Sure.
This is something that like we're only really sort of recognizing in the last few years. There's been like a lot, just like with older movies, there's always rediscovery of older music going on. And one thing that like I've paid attention to recently is like the discovery of like the weird psychedelic rock that was coming out of Vietnam and Cambodia and Indonesia during the time. It's like there was an opportunity here for them to use a song that was less played out than frickin' White Rabbit, which I don't even think doesn't fit the scene.
Yeah,
nobody is stoned.
And Grace Slick hated playing that tune.
It's like
she has to play it.
I mean, it's just this thing. It's just this thing where it's like you're just putting White Rabbit in there because it's White Rabbit, but there's no connection to anything that the characters are experiencing. Nothing that occurs in the scene is psychedelic. This isn't a scene about psychedelics. This is a scene it's a titty bar.
Right.
It should be something grimier. Like if you're going to use an American song, like people in Southeast Asia, they weren't always getting the hit records. If you were getting the sort of contraband records that you were coming in, you were basically getting whatever you could get. You could just as easily pay less money that rather than getting the top dollar White Rabbit, you could pay less money for a more interesting, grittier, grimier song that you might hear in a whorehouse. And so it's like, and so we're introduced to White Rabbit, then we're introduced to Brie Larson, again, up and coming starlet at the time the movie is being made. She is a activist, anti-war photographer and journalist.
This is your modern day Jane Fonda.
Yeah, our modern day Jane Fonda, and she, and so she.
And by the way, she's probably, I hate to say it, she's probably the most fleshed out character of them all, quite frankly.
Well, to the extent,
it's just, even though they're so poorly done, but really, she is one of the better.
Well, there's definitely more attention to her and Tom Hiddleston's flesh than anybody else,
that's true.
And that's going to be a thing. And
I don't want to spend an hour on that.
We're not going to spend an hour on that. Okay. But then, of course, Long Cool Woman in a black dress by the Hollies is playing, and it's like, what? Why would she be listening to Long Cool Woman in a black dress? Can't she at least listen to some Judy Collins, or somebody, or Codine? Again, something grimier. Not everything needs to be funky. Like that's the thing. If you just put these like now that's what I call music hits into your soundtrack. It's not just that it makes the scene less interesting. It says something about your character. It says something that all of the characters in this movie, they only listen to the hits.
Right.
Nobody is interesting.
Who do you think this is for?
Exactly.
It's the audience.
Well, it's not just for the audience because at the end of the day, the audience...
How many movies have you seen?
But I'm saying the filmmakers are the ones who are picking the soundtrack.
I know, that's what I meant. They did it for that.
But here's the thing. Jordan Vogt-Roberts, he said it explicitly on the audio commentary, is that like he meticulously chose these tracks, and this is what he comes
could have stumbled over him.
but this is the thing. Yeah, exactly. It's like, so like just throughout the film, we're going to get the Stooges down on the street and Black Sabbath's Paranoid. And I'm sorry, nobody in the U.S. Army is listening to the Stooges and Black Sabbath in the early 70s, okay? That is strictly a queer, heroin-addicted New York City or industrial hellscape of Liverpool thing. That is not something that is in the American idiom. Neither is Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie, and no less than 2 Creedence Clearwater Revival songs, Bad Moon Rising and Run Through the Jungle. And of course, this isn't a 70s hit, but of course we're going to get to hear We'll Meet Again by Vera Lynn. Jordan Vogt-Roberts literally has only knows music through movies, and I think that's the thing. And
didn't you say that once before? These people, the way they come up, they're so focused in their their craft, but they're so, how do you say, inbred that they
Well,
really haven't looked
there's
out.
they're so inundated with
Yeah.
mass culture,
Culture,
and
yeah.
it becomes this thing where it's like they're very consummate in popular culture, but they're not very literate. So to someone like Jordan Vogt-Roberts, he's basically just made a playlist of some of his favorite psychedelic rock songs and blues rock and southern rock from the late 60s and the early 70s, rather than buckling down and doing the research and saying, what is the song that is appropriate for this character?
Right.
What is the song that is appropriate for this scene? What is really going to put the audience in the situation?
Right.
Rather than have them saying, oh, I recognize that. That's Time Has Come Today. I remember when I first heard that in Forrest Gump. It's like any song that it was ever used in Forrest Gump. That's the thing, is like Forrest Gump comes along, it has this amazing soundtrack, all of these songs that had not been heard by American audiences for literal decades except on oldie stations suddenly get new life in the 90s, just like with Dazed and Confused, it sparks this sparks this
Or
like
Boogie Nights.
Yeah, it sparks this re-infatuation with older music. But there's always deeper cuts, and there's always this attention to picking the song.
And it's more appropriate, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's always an attention to picking the song that will
create the mood.
That will
that
create
fits
the mood,
right.
rather than you just. But now it's just like, oh yeah, that's a Jefferson Airplane. That's White Rabbit.
Yeah,
I've heard that
that's what
before in a
happens. Like
million
you said,
different scenes, and it's
and I
diluted
think-
of all meaning.
Right, it is. You're absolutely right.
So we're introduced to all of these characters in time. And the problem is we are introduced to all of these characters. We have all of our exposition unloaded to us. So Brie Larson joins the expedition. She's basically just gets a hot tip. It's, she's got like her nose is to the wind. She smells like
the war's over, right? The war's been given up.
The war's
given
over.
Up, right,
yes.
they're giving up the war.
So
right,
she realizes, like, all right, there's no way that this scientific expedition is going out to an island with that much firepower, and there's not something else going on underneath the surface of this. So she just puts her ear to the ground. She goes with her gut. So we're introduced to all these characters, but here's the problem. There is not the least bit of suspense to anything that happens, because before all this happens, we are given a scene in which we are literally having John Goodman stretch out his hand to the audience and say, hi, I am the head of a secret organization. It is a secret organization that nobody knows about. Why does nobody know about it? Because nobody is supposed to know about it, because we're doing all sorts of weird things that are going to totally blow your mind. Now, here are the things we're investigating. It's like, why did you introduce the movie that way? Here's an easy way to restructure the 2 hours of running time that you have so that you can better explore your characters. Rather than doing it like introducing John Goodman first and then going through all the other characters being recruited. So obviously we skipped over the first part, which is that the movie actually opens in 1944. It starts with these two airplanes that have crashed in a dogfight. There's an American Air Service member and a Japanese pilot. They're fighting it out on Skull Island, and they encounter King Kong. Then it cuts to the opening credit sequence, and then we flash forward to the 1970s. Obviously, John C. Reilly is going to turn out to be the American pilot who crash landed on Skull Island back in the 40s. So you have that sort of semi-mysterious opening. But then you completely despoil it by just, again, having John Goodman say, hi, I am the head of a secret organization, therefore completely destroying any possible suspense that you could have created by just having John Goodman pretend to be a scientist with just a completely banal and a credible research expedition, and then a giant monkey attacks them, and then Samuel L. Jackson's putting a gun to his head and saying, you knew this was going to be happening all along.
Who are you really?
Yeah, who are you really?
Open up now.
Or suddenly your scene actually has tension because you don't know who John Goodman is really.
Right.
And so even more than that, so you cut from the scene of these two Americans, these two pilots, one white and one Asian, fighting it out and then experiencing Kong. Then what you do, you cut straight to Vietnam. You cut straight to that Army air hangar. You cut straight to Samuel L. Jackson looking at the box full of the medals of all of his service members that have died under his command and saying, what the hell was this all for? You thematically connect these things, and you show the continuity there, and you leave room for suspense. Then you introduce Brie Larson's character. You have her saying, I'm going to go on this, I'm gonna thank you for getting me this spot on this scientific expedition. Then you go to Tom Hiddleston, and because the way the scene is structured now, we follow John Goodman into the bar, who now has to have more exposition where he explains to his sidekick why they need to get a hunter tracker to help them on the expedition, rather, even though they already have the army. When what you could do, just have the scene from Tom Hiddleston's perspective. Establish some mystery, establish some suspense, then you can proceed with your story. Then suddenly, once they're flying their helicopters over Skull Island, and then they suddenly can encounter, and then suddenly that first, again, this really ingenious image of literally a tree being thrown like a spear, like an anti-aircraft missile through the air and just going right through the windshield of a helicopter, a really ingenious image. Now, not only is it still funny, it's funnier because you're slamming the audience with this thing that...
I don't know if it's funny, but that's up to you. You think it's funny. I didn't think it was necessarily
I thought it was hilarious. Are you kidding? Like, this is the thing.
No,
It's
I
like,
just thought it was... I thought it was brilliant to have an immediate scene of violence perpetrated by a creature that was pissed off because they're sending, echolocation devices, explosives down on the bottom so that they could figure out what.
Ostensibly they're setting off. They immediately start dropping bombs because ostensibly they're trying to test for the hollow Earth theory.
Right.
They're trying to test if there's a hollow chamber underneath the island. Of course, it's true, but then they wake up Kong, and Kong immediately just.
Well, I don't think they wake him up. They just get him pissed off, right?
Well, they do.
Maybe
wake...
they did wake him up.
Well, it doesn't really matter because they start dropping bombs, and then Kong immediately wakes up and he starts like clowning on them mercilessly. He even eats a guy. I mean, we don't see it explicitly.
He falls in his mouth like if you toss a charm up in the air and catch it.
I mean, he looks. He like the scene does make it look very much like he's trying to shake the guy out of the helicopter so that it falls into his mouth. But again, the point being that if you just wrote these scenes and structured them in such a way where you deny the audience just a little bit of information, it goes that much further to making sure, number one, you would have cut out a lot of bullshit involving John Goodman just explaining what is going on and what is literally about to happen.
Right.
And not only do you cut down on it, you make the impact of that sudden violence, whether you're horrified or like I was doing where I was laughing my ass off.
Mm-hmm. You could have cut out the whole scene with Richard Jenkins, and then you could have.
Absolutely. You
could have it go right with Samuel Jackson getting the blowdown from John Goodman at gunpoint.
Yeah, exactly.
We were funded to do this because America doesn't want to have another country get the edge on this particular find.
Yeah.
And here's what et cetera, et cetera. And then of course it makes the obvious sort of allegory, this obvious sort of ham-fisted allegory that the film is drawing between the imperialism of the American war machine and the politics of the Cold War that led us to the quagmire in Vietnam, waist deep in the big muddy. There is literally a scene in the film where the soldiers are walking waist deep through the big muddy in this movie, and they're literally asking each other, should we follow this big fool who keeps telling us to push on? It's like, it's not subtle. Obviously Kong, Viet Cong, it's like it's not even allegory at this point. Like, and the film doesn't have the capacity for allegory. But even on that level, you at least take something that on its surface is just kind of crass and stupid
and you just allow it to be a little bit more evocative.
Yeah.
Because now, instead of opening your movie with saying, well, we're really worried about the Russians, we're worried about the Cold War, now you follow the through line of Samuel L. Jackson's point of view as somebody who thinks we were sent here to die for this cause, and we were completely betrayed by our own countrymen and by these activists, and we were totally because that's the thing. On a certain level, he knows that they were manipulated. On a certain level, he must know that there was a lost cause, because at the beginning of the movie, he's talking to Brie Larson's character, and Brie Larson says, you're not really going to blame a photographer for losing the war. And he says, we didn't lose the war.
We gave up.
We gave up.
Right.
And then later in the movie, when like he's, you know, like they say in Doctor Strangelove, when he goes a bit funny in the head, he literally says, this is a war with the war with Kong. This is a war that we are not going to lose.
Right.
So on a certain level, he knows that they were betrayed. He knows that they were sent to die for nothing. But so you create this really intriguing, evocative scene where you follow it through his perspective. You follow his arc as a character to confronting John Goodman, and then John Goodman saying, yeah, you were an like Predator, you were an expendable asset, and we used you to get the job done. And there are just certain things that you, as a functionary of this empire, that you are not allowed to know. All of those things are immediately deflated by the fact that we already know every detail, every
Right.
crumb along the
Right.
way.
Well, we usually say too much explanation, right?
Too much exposition.
Exposition.
It is the death of, and so you could have solved two things by cutting. So going back to what's catalyzed this whole conversation, just that bad line. You have two justifications for cutting out that scene. One of the justifications is it makes your film more evocative, more suspenseful. You have more mystery. Another is you, as a room full of writers, do not waste a lot of time trying to squeeze comedy in an area that you obviously have so little strength in. This is not your forte. If you wanted a comedy writer, you should have brought in someone like Phil Lord and Chris Miller, the guys who did 21 Jump Street, a great action comedy. Or like the guys, you know, like you bring in comedy writers. If that is what you want to do, like I would even say like Evan Goldberg, Seth Rogen, they don't have the same technical sophistication, but they can still make like action comedies. The Interview is full of the exact kind of like repulsive black comic violence and sudden like dispatching of characters. Like, the guys who, Ben Stiller wrote Tropic Thunder. Tropic Thunder is filled with all the sorts of like, hilarious like death and violence that you see in Kong Skull Island. So that's another thing, is that like the people who are behind this have been hired to write the film, and in such a way that doesn't play to their strengths at all. But I think it even speaks to something a little bit more insidious, is that the real reason that this comes from listening to the audio commentary for the film. At the end of the day, the real reason that the movie opens the way it does is because the producers, the production company of the film, they wanted to have a scene in the opening that established a connection to Godzilla. And we see it explicitly where literally John Goodman hands a portfolio to Richard Jenkins. He shows him a photograph and says, oh, the Castle Bravo test, they were trying to kill something. And it's just like, I'm sorry, if John Goodman has been going to this guy over and over again to beg for money, wouldn't he know this shit already? Wouldn't he have been shown this photograph of this oil tanker or this submarine that has giant claw marks in it? Wouldn't he know this already? And here's the thing, listening to the audio commentary, John vogt-roberts, here's how little control really he had over the actual story of the film and over like the narrative direction that they were going with the franchise. Literally, the photograph that we see was not even going to be as, charitable terms, subtle as just showing a submarine with claw marks in it. It was literally going to be a photograph of Godzilla's spines coming out of the water. And he specifies in the audio commentary, I really had to fight to make it so that they don't just, because at the very least, he is making a movie called Kong Skull Island. And so now he's fighting an uphill battle with these bean counters who are literally, all they see this movie as an opportunity to do is as a fulcrum to launch a franchise. He literally just has to fight with them just to say, this is a King Kong movie. If you go ahead and put Godzilla at the opening of the film, it kind of dilutes what the movie is about. Like, this is supposed to be a movie. Like, you don't want to give people the impression that there's nothing special or unique about what they're watching. And this is really the thing where it comes down to my sudden realization, which is that part of the reason that the writing, the narrative structuring of Kong Skull Island is so poor is because in contemporary, hyper-consolidated, multinational conglomerate Hollywood, it is literally against the rules to write a film well. You have to write it poorly. You get the notes from your executives that are saying, this is the purpose that this movie is supposed to serve in a franchise. They receive a draft of the screenplay, and then they say to you, we literally need a scene at the beginning of this picture where the characters explain everything that is going to happen. And it's just like, why would you do that? Why would anybody who's even the slightest bit interested in making a good film, why would they do that? And of course, they're not interested in making a good film. What they're interested in doing is they're not even interested in making a giant monster movie. The reason that they're doing this, the reason that they're pushing so hard on introducing not only the connection to Godzilla, but specifically the connective tissue of this secret organization called Monarch, is because in their minds, they're thinking, well, in the Marvel Avengers movies, these movies that make a whole bunch of money, the connective tissue between those films was a secret organization called S.H.I.E.L.D., so we need a secret organization in our film that is going to be called Monarch. So really, we need to foreground the fact that Monarch is in this movie. And that needs to be the driving first thing that we are introduced to about this narrative. It's just like what we talked about last time with, in terms of Universal's horrible, dark universe attempt culminating in The Mummy. You're taking something that it's this insufferable attempt to make every blockbuster, every action spectacle movie, and retrofit it to basically be a superhero movie, to basically be a comic book film. And it fundamentally doesn't work on a certain level. And I mean, it's like, because that's the thing, isn't it? Is that like Kong in this movie is not really a monster. And that's the other thing. Like when we're in, Kong is like cool sometimes in the movie, but I wouldn't say he's ever evocative.
It just is, like you said, he's a superhero, benign and detached from, anything that's going on. And just like, then you have to explain that he maintains the balance within this planet or this particular island.
Right.
And that's explained to you.
Literally explained.
Right.
Yeah,
So it tells you right up front, right?
Of course, so I guess we should, again, I think this goes back to like the terrible comedy of the movie. We get introduced to John C. Reilly, who is, of course, that same American pilot who crash landed in the 1940s. Apparently, like, he has been living there with a tribe of the islanders who worship and are protected by Kong, who in this film are portrayed not as in the original movie, as cannibal savages who engage in human sacrifice, but literally something that I think is just as kind of offensive and patronizing, which is literally as these totally mute, hermetically sealed characters who literally they have this totally internally like self-sufficient society that of course, you know, like there's no serious attempt to dwell upon like how they exist in like homogeneity with the earth. It's like, again, all of the things that they could have shown, which is like people farming or people fishing or people like, you know, it's like even just attempting to get them to stay with this tribe of characters even just a little bit more to show different aspects of their culture could have gone a long way in humanizing them in the way that they're clearly attempting to do. There's this clear attempt to go against the grain of previous King Kong movies of portraying these indigenous native peoples as savages. But I felt so uncomfortable. Like, there's this entire scene where it's like Brie Larson as like this typical, like, she almost is like this like white, like tourist or like almost like an influencer. Like suddenly she completely transforms from a journalist to somebody who's just like giggling in this. She has like this slow motion montage of her like giggling and getting everybody together and
taking peace sign
and doing the peace sign into the
totally,
photograph. It's like,
what
serious journalist?
Right. We're totally inappropriate.
Oh my God. Just totally on the Brie Larson tip, even when they're just arriving at the island, when they're coming in through the helicopters, the thing that really made me like cringe was they're coming in on the helicopters. They finally get through the hurricane that is surrounding the island. And once they punch through and they're going through the canyons of the island, Brie Larson goes, "Woo!" in the most inauthentic way. And I'm sitting here thinking, why would she go woo? She's been on a helicopter for. She's a freaking war correspondent. She's been in so much. She's been in, as they say, the suck. You know, it's like there's nothing special here. Why is she going woo like she's a little girl on a theme park ride? Like, there are so many weird and patronizing decisions that are made that sort of exemplify in a more direct way what we were talking about in terms of music and in terms of the structuring of the story, which is the incredible lack of investment in really clarifying like who these characters are and why we're supposed to be interested in them and what the conflict is supposed to be between them, you know? And it especially comes out when we see these natives, because it's just like, it's the most patronizing thing. Like, there's absolutely no attempt there's an attempt to make them less quote unquote savage. But I'm going to actually make the argument that, you know, Marion C. Cooper, this guy who makes the original King Kong, obviously he's an incredibly racist guy. Like, he's literally a good old boy, old plantation aristocracy white guy. He is literally you can find quotes from him expressing his belief in the inherent biological superiority of white people. But here's the thing. In as much as Marion C. Cooper's films reflect his obvious white supremacist values, Marion C. Cooper as a person literally went to these places. He went to Africa. He went to Southeast Asia. He went to the Middle East. He literally spent time living with and around these types of people. So even to the extent that what attracted him to them and what he focused upon were the elements that made them the most exotic and exciting to a racist white supremacist audience, at the same time, there is a fundamental and intuitive humanity that you can understand about them. Like, when you see Noble Johnson as the cannibal chief in King Kong, not only is it a great performance, but you understand them. The way that we're introduced to them, fundamentally, yes, from a certain perspective, they're doing something savage, but fundamentally, in just this brief scene, we are introduced to them through their culture. We are introduced to them through their theology. We are introduced to them through a complete understanding of how they see the world and how their society functions, and this interest in a kind of portraying them through these things that, despite the fact that they're portrayed in a racist way, even the racism has like a humanizing kernel to it. There's no humanity to the natives in Kong Skull Island. And the weird thing is that it seems to be directly a function of the filmmakers basically trying to not be racist, to just go in the complete opposite direction of like, let's just make all of these natives just mute pacifist Buddhas living in this isolated island community. And as a result, what do we not see? We don't see them eating. We don't see them communing with each other, except to get in a photograph for Brie Larson. We don't see them hunting. We don't see them fishing. We don't see them farming. We don't see them planting. We don't see them dancing. We don't see them creating music. We don't see them doing all of the bog standard human things that indigenous peoples do, no matter how isolated they are. And I think it's just incredible that I'm watching this movie Kong Skull Island and I'm thinking to myself, in a weird way, this is actually more racist than the 1933 film. They're not characters. They are literally just an ornamental mask.
Placeholders.
Literally for the enjoyment and for the ideological
He
fantasy.
could have been alone. Why the hell are they there? They don't do anything.
All right, here's the
But someone has to raise the bridge, though.
Here's the literally they're doormen. Literally, they're turned into doormen so the characters can get from point A to point B.
Right, they sort of ship and go through.
But here's I'm going to go in a wild direction. Hear me? Rather than taking the natives completely out of the picture and keeping John C. Reilly, here's an idea. Cut John C. Reilly out of the movie and put in some actual conflict. Some actual tension where suddenly Tom Hiddleston and Brie Larson and all these other characters are confronted with these natives. They don't speak the same language. They have been isolated from the rest of the world for the entirety of their existence. There is this huge chasm between them. There's distrust. There's the threat of violence. And of course, who do we have on the other side of the island but literally Samuel L. Jackson and his pack of psychos coming over the hill at any moment who... at the very least, if you're going to do like this dumb Vietnam allegory, at least make it a little less glib by like actually saying, you know what, maybe we should actually like focus on these natives as characters. Like maybe like we should maybe there should be a little bit less attention on the Americans and the imperialists, and maybe we show them,
like you said, or at least arrive at some kind of conflict.
Right, exactly. Do something interesting, for the love of God. Because what do we get instead? What we get instead is more exposition. We meet John C. Reilly just so he can explain more things to the audience, as exemplified in this clip where he is describing the
skull crawlers.
The skull crawlers. That
was a horrible scene.
All right, but let's let the listening, the home audience really dwell on just how awful this dialogue is. Just listen.
Kong's God on the island, but the devils live below us.
And what are they called?
The Iwis won't speak their name, but I call them skull crawlers.
Why?
Because it sounds neat.
Okay.
Look, I just made that name up. I'm trying to scare you.
I'm fine calling them that. Are you cool with it?
Yeah, that seems like
I like the name,
a
so
great
I
name.
think you...
I've never said that name out loud before. It sounds stupid now that I say it. Just, you call them whatever you want.
Yeah,
Just-
terrible.
just
Absolutely horrible.
Comedy death. Nothing funny about this.
If this were a comedy act in a local bar, there would be pin drops. You'd hear the ice still tinkling.
The only reason the filmmakers think, and obviously this is a general problem in American comedy where characters will basically say something that is supposed to be absurd, and then a bunch of other characters will comment upon, well, wasn't that absurd? Like, there's obviously a problem in general in American comedy nowadays where it's not about just crafting a viscerally humorous gag or joke. It's literally about just putting something in that is quote unquote ridiculous or quirky, and then have like this glib, ironic, detached winking to the audience where the characters literally say, oh, isn't that kind of kooky and absurd? And it's just like, but at least with comedy writers, it's like, well, he's a comedy writer. At least when it's done in like a Seth Rogen, or an Evan Goldberg movie or a Ben Stiller movie, at least there you're saying, well, they're trying. They're trying to do a bit of humor. Like, you understand where they're coming from. These guys are not comedy writers. Why are they doing this type of scene? It is not at all what their strengths are. And this gets to an even more important point, which is like, John C. Reilly is not in this film because his character is essential to the plot or because it serves any evocative purpose in the narrative. It's not because it's thematically compelling. He's there to be a comic relief guy.
I don't know.
And it's just, and the entire, whatever momentum the movie has grinds to a halt the moment he is in the picture, because he's an amazing, here's the thing, I'm sorry, John C. Reilly is an incredible dramatic actor. He just is. Has no one else seen him in Chicago? He's amazing. You don't have to have John C. Reilly in this movie and have him being a jokey joke, sort of crack-brained, like an old prospector living on Skull Island. Why doesn't he get to be dramatic? How about fucking all of those also-rand grunt soldiers whose literally their only purpose in the film is to get killed? Leave them be the comic relief, because that's obviously where their strengths are in the film. That's where the comedic strengths are in this movie. It's in the elaborate, ingenious, sudden violence.
I just like seeing him in the movie. I mean, I have to admit, though, he's not, I mean, his purpose is like, no purpose. Although, and they try to make it somewhat pithy, or try to make it more involved in the fact that we learned that he actually bonded with his enemy, and his enemy taught him how to use a samurai sword.
Right.
So, and that was not explained, but it was clear.
And obviously it's supposed to be part of the broader sort of pacifist point of the movie, which is that, it's like, it's only in this isolated world. It's only when it's only when both of them are completely uncoupled from the competitive imperialist projects of their country that they realize their commonality as human beings, and they realize they have more in common than what separates them. What it's doing in a movie that is ostensibly an allegory for Vietnam, and this is the fundamental problem of the movie, is that, like, I mean, there's a lot of fundamental problems with the movie, but even in terms of its being like a big, dumb, ham-fisted allegory,
I don't know what's an allegory for. What are you talking about? I don't think
clearly it's an allegory about imperialism and the legacy of American imperialism in Southeast Asia. Again, Skull Island, like
even in Skull Island.
Well, but just as an example, Skull Island is Vietnam. King Kong is literally the Viet Cong, and the indigenous Wee, the islanders of Skull Island, they are literally like a proto-communist, literal communal self-sufficient society that lives and communicates entirely through magic telepathy or whatever the fuck.
Right. They don't say much.
Yeah, it's a perfect communist story, and all of the problems are created literally just through the imposition of the American imperialist army. They send in their, for ostensibly for the purposes of scientific progress and beating the Russians so that we will stop the spread of some corrosive ideology. Literally, the devil in the form of the skull crawlers is manifested from the ground, and it's up to King Kong to put them down. But the problem is that it's the same thing where it's like there's this glibness to the movie, which is exemplified in a few other points throughout it that sort of really hammers home the, and I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with Godzilla, where, again, I think there's a lot of good things about Godzilla, and I think overall the message of the film is somewhat, it's obviously to me a critique of the, it's basically portraying allegorically the manifestation of America's unique extractive role and destruction of ecology and the environment, which is manifested in the form of the Mutos as this monstrous nuclear family that is literally going to extract all of the world's resources and overpopulate and overrun and destroy the planet. That's the message of the film. But I can understand the argument that to a certain extent, the movie is part of a pattern of American films that allude and do not sufficiently confront the direct relationship of the American government in the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and specifically the question of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki themselves, in the nuclear testing in the Bikini Atoll, and the unconscionable ecological damage and the damage to human health and life that it continues to be perpetuated to this
Yeah, they
very
even
day.
use napalm, right?
Yeah.
In this movie.
Yeah, so like I can understand and I can understand I can understand that critique. It's and in Kong Skull Island we see the same thing, but we see it now even in an even more recent historical scenario, which is the imperialist wars in Vietnam and Cambodia. These abjectly awful, first a proxy war and then an outright imperialist invasion that we were fighting, in order to expand the hegemony of Western capitalism. That is what Vietnam was about. And like a lot of Americans in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the sort of dark sort of inward turn of the post-Vietnam era, what we call, where Americans became more disillusioned and more inwardly drawn and more solipsistic, not really confronting what had just happened. In terms of how many millions of lives we had completely destroyed for no reason other than the monetary benefit of the ruling classes of our own country. That is what Vietnam was about, and yet what we see in Kong Skull Island is very true to the pattern of post-Vietnam American films about Vietnam, which suddenly it becomes this vague humanistic scenario. Suddenly you have them inserting, let's take a Japanese character and an American character from World War II and show that, eventually they actually got along. They realize that we're all human and they realize, there's no reason to be fighting. And I'm like, I'm sorry. Number one, it's emblematic of the film's racism. The war between Japan and America was completely different than the war in Vietnam. I'm sorry. It's not even the least bit comparable. The only reason these things are being compared is because, the Japanese are Asian and the Vietnamese are Asian, so isn't this basically the same thing? No. The war between America and Japan was a war between two competing imperialist powers. The war in Vietnam was a completely one-sided American imperialist experiment where we attempted to support a genocidal Catholic puppet regime to eliminate what we saw as the threat of the spread of socialism and communism in South and Southeast Asia. It's not even comparable. It is not a question of us not recognizing the mutual humanity of the Vietnamese. It's the fact that we didn't care. We saw them as clients, and we saw our relationship with them as really just a way for us to be able to, in the future, expand our global hegemonic influence and basically make the people of that country our clients, our subjects for cheap labor, our subjects for cheap manufacturing, our subjects for consumption. And so it becomes this thing where it's like we said, where it's the weird thing because obviously John C. Reilly's character is the one who has the closest thing to an arc of anybody in this movie. And I think it's very telling that the way this movie ends is John C. Reilly finds his wife who hasn't seen him, his child who is now fully grown, living with his mother. He reunites with them. He has a tearful embrace with his wife who hasn't seen him in decades. And then the final image of this home movie that is rolling with the end credits. He's sitting in front of a TV, watching baseball, drinking a beer, and eating a hot dog.
Right. What was his favorite team? I forget. One that doesn't win much, but
I think it's the Cubs.
Right, something like that. Yeah.
And it's I'm sorry, this is wrong. This is what is wrong with the American reaction to not just Vietnam. It is the reaction to every single imperialist excursion that we participate in. In response, we say, oh boy, that was really bad. we kind of did a lot of awful things, and there's kind of no going back from the damage we have done. The interesting thing is that Kong Skull Island actually presents a scenario in which Kong literally magically gets rid of the thing that we are responsible for creating, which is not what happens, and then furthermore, John C. Reilly, as literally this greatest generation American, goes back home and just gets to do what all Americans love to do, which is sit in front of their TV and consume and be inwardly drawn and not engage with anything in the world around them. And I think, there is a kind of insidiousness to Kong Skull Island. It's not just the glibness. It's the complete detachment from any sort of real, even on the stupid level, that even on the broad scattershot level that it's attempting to use this allegory to really confront just how pernicious, and just how globally corrosive Americans' influence has been in the latter half of the 20th century. And I think, it's not just, so it's at that point, it no longer becomes a question of Kong Skull Island being a bad movie. It becomes a question of, this is one of a long line of movies that is basically, its stupidity inures you, glibly detaches you from something that is incredibly real. So you get to laugh it off when when the soldier, what was the name of the character? He's the one who tries to sacrifice himself by getting the monster to swallow him while he's holding his grenade. But then the monster realizes what he's doing and he whips him with his tail.
No, I don't think the monster realized. That's the precariousness of animals. He just hit him with the tail instead.
I don't
think it knew. But just
whatever happens, obviously, again, that's an ingenious moment, and that's where
there are a lot of ingenious moments
but that's where the comedic strengths of the movie actually are. It's
right.
It really, and that's the thing that's kind of dark about it. All the ingeniousness of the movie comes out when people need to die horribly.
Right, but also it does give in a way, if you want to make this as an allegory, the futility of war and how we lost. So
even the hilarious futility of war.
Even some of the main characters, for example, that are summarily dispatched. For example, when the character in Jack Chapman, right? We had the dog tags, right? Jack Chapman, it confronts a giant walking stick.
Yeah.
And it's very reminiscent to Avatar, where he thinks he's scaring away the creature, and it turns out that's behind him is another creature that's actually scaring away. So the insect leaves, and the guy thinks, "Oh, I scared him off," and not realizing that behind him is one of the skull. The skull crawlers.
Yeah.
No, and again, the futility. The idea is he gets eaten, and the really ingenious. It's a shame. There's so many good shots in here that could have been a much better movie, like you said. And all of them are futile. All these things are futile. If anybody gets killed, it's the futility of the war effort and whatever they are doing.
And here's the thing, and this is where this is where it could have been more subversive, because the futility is not presented as tragic. The futility is presented where the point of comedy and mockery should be, which is on the American side of things.
Like Jackson saying, "This is our war to go for," and he gets, he's finished too. He doesn't make it either. So I don't know. It's just all around. It's I just think that the film has a lot of good things, qualities to it, but it's really marred terribly by the.
Well, it's like I said, this is a movie
it's boring.
It's by executive order, it is deliberately written poorly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it did all right in the box office. They made some money. So.
But here's the weird thing. All right, I'm going to table that until we come back for an episode on the Godzilla King of the Monsters, because that movie bombed incredibly. So we'll investigate the finances of this film. But before we go out, I do want to briefly talk about, there's this great article that was published on a website called Blood Knife on February 14th. Of this year, by an author named R.S. Benedict, called "Everyone is Beautiful and No One is Horny." It's this really great piece where she sort of, in a very loose way, she analyzes the extent to which that are contemporary blockbuster films, not just blockbuster films, but those in particular are superhero franchise movies, of which, Kong Skull Island is obviously derivative, as we've said. They are so much more body focused in a superficial way, but there is this weird sexlessness to contemporary filmmaking. And I do want to read this great quote from the piece. Like, let's not pretend that old Hollywood was a progressive haven of body positivity. Since the departure of voluptuous vamp Theda Bara from the silver screen, actors have always gone to extremes to maintain a certain look. Rita Hayworth underwent an ethnic makeover to appear more Caucasian so she could get leading roles. Stars of the 1920s limited their fluid consumption to 2 glasses a day to avoid water weight. Jane Fonda suffered from severe bulimia at the height of her sex symbol status. So did Marlon Brando. But old films still featured recognizable human bodies and human faces, bodies that could theoretically be achieved by a single person without the aid of a team of personal trainers, dietitians, private chefs, and chemists. In the films of the 80s and 90s, leading actors were good-looking, yes, but still human. Kurt Russell's Snake Plissken was a hunk, but in shirtless scenes, his abs had no definition. Bruce Willis was handsome, but he's more muscular now than he was in the 90s, when he was routinely branded a bona fide sex symbol. Yep. And when Isabella Rossellini strips in blue velvet, her skin is pale and her body is soft. She looks vulnerable and real. And I'm sorry, like, with Brie Larson and Tom Hiddleston headlining this movie, again, these people who are virtually sculpted to be in Marvel movies, these perfect specimens of humanity, it's weird because they not only feel out of place in a movie that is ostensibly to take place in the 70s, but even if you just compare it to the King Kong movie that was literally created in the 70s, if you think of Jessica Lange and what's the name of the
Bridges.
Yeah, Jeff Bridges in that movie, obviously, like the author is saying, they're beautiful, but their beauty is attainable. And also, that is the weird thing, isn't it? Is that it might be like the same thing with the filmmakers attempting to like correct for the racism of the past movies, is that they've desexualized Kong. There is no element of the story in which there is like a sort of romantic interest between, say, Kong and Brie Larson or whoever, or Tom Middleton for that matter.
Infatuation.
Yeah, exactly.
An animal infatuation with something unique.
Yeah.
Right.
And I was thinking
but there is one. It is slightly mentioned because Brie Larson interacts twice with him.
Yeah.
And there is some kind of connection there. So,
but it's humanitarian in nature because Kong sort of sees her attempt, because there's this giant water buffalo that has a helicopter crashed on it, and she tries to push it up just enough so that it can get free. Then Kong helps her. And then so later on, Kong recognizes her when she is almost drowns in the fight with the skull crawler, and so he rescues her. And so there's this sort of weird connection between.
Yeah, but it's not
But it's not romantic. It's humanitarian.
Right.
It's like, oh, you're a nice lady.
Well, no, both her and Tom Hiddleston's character.
Yeah, that's the other weird thing is that like there's it's almost like they're like this,
I think
their arc as characters isn't even romantic. It's just that they become good buddies.
Well, there was
Like, I think it's amazing because there is this one scene where it's almost like in Jurassic Park where they're overlooking the cliff or they're in the tree and they see the brachiosaurs. There's a dead ringer for that scene where they're on the edge of this cliff and Kong walks right up to them, and Brie Larson puts her hand on Kong's lip and really, feels him for real and has the teary-eyed moment of like, but and then what's weird is that she's afraid at first, but rather than grabbing Tom Hiddleston's hand, she grabs him by the wrist and his fist is just clenched. There's it's like this attempt at like a kind of intimacy, but where it's almost like they are just bludgeoning you over the head with the idea that this is not a sexual intimacy. This is a totally platonic friendship that has evolved. This straight man and straight woman in the 70s developed no sexual chemistry when they were alone on a hot tropical island.
Again, a lot of these situations take time to develop. And you can't. It's not. It doesn't. In this film lacks organic.
Yeah. Even if you wanted that
seemingly organic writing, and
Yeah.
so because of that, and I would have to admit, most of your, if I'm not mistaken, many of your action movies don't have any more.
Yeah, they're sexless.
Well,
They're-
but there's a
this
reason for
weird-
that, though. You're talking about PG-13 movie, and you're talking about a time in our history where we've gone backwards sexually.
Yeah, we're way more
We're
puritanical
more
now.
puritanical now than ever before, and
At the
so-
level of sex, at the level of
which is really
at the
strange
level of
because
violence.
this is 1973, so
Right,
you should have had
exactly.
something going on.
Like we're literally introduced to Tom Hiddleston in a brothel. Like it's like, and
He's
it's
playing
totally
pool.
asexual. You don't get. He's playing pool. He's literally just playing with his pole in the corner. He's just throwing his balls around. It's like, and it's not sexual. How do you do that? And of course, and that's the thing is that like the sheer sex.
It would have been better if they broke open the door and found him with a woman up. Like those two guys would go upstairs to his roof, to find
Or at
him-
least, yeah, like find him like smoking,
brothel.
like find him
Yeah.
smoking some opium. Just this sad-faced, like Vietnamese woman or Cambodian woman,
exactly.
just like looking at him with utter disdain.
Right.
Like you white people are all the same. Like and that's the thing is that like
But you don't wanna create-
But here's the thing: we're puritanical about sex,
No, but also-
the violence is getting glibber and more detached
Yep.
and more extreme, even in PG-13 movies. Someone gets eaten, someone
No.
gets stomped,
I'm
someone
sorry.
gets impaled through the throat by
With
a giant
Now that was
spider's
R-rated.
leg.
That should have been R-rated.
Fucking someone, holy crap, I'm trying to remember. Someone gets like is kidnapped by the pterosaurs, like
And torn apart.
and torn apart. Like his leg just literally gets scissored off by one of the creatures. They're literally dividing him up. A guy crashes into the windshield of a helicopter and then gets chewed up in the propellers.
Right. So
Like-
the violence in this is not PG-13.
This is the thing. Kong Skull Island, in addition to its screenplay seemingly being written by an AI algorithm of literally you fed a computer screenplays from various other superhero and blockbuster action movies and told it to randomly generate something based on those parameters. In addition to that, it is a perfect distillation of just how much more violent our supposedly middle-brow PG-13 appropriate for teenagers movies have come, but how completely bereft they are of just basic sexual intimacy.
Yep.
Like the sort of, again, it's like here's the thing. The 1970s, and this is the thing, it's like, it's weird. The 1970s King Kong was a punching bag for the longest time, and you and I have had our critiques of it on this show before. But with every decade, the 70s Kong looks better and better. And even especially when you can compare it to Kong Skull Island, because what you see there is the campiness is funnier. Like the irony of the situation is so much more humorous. But also there's this sense of like there's better development of the characters. There's this greater sense of mystery, that wonderful evocative image of Jessica Lange just floating on a lifeboat out of nowhere, like fate has delivered her to this ship to be transported to Kong. You know, even these campy images of Kong like holding her under a waterfall and literally just ogling her and then blowing her, you know, literally being a hot air dryer for her, but just blowing on her. You know, there's so many elements of it that are obviously ridiculous, but are legitimately kind of both absurd and kind of poignant and effective on an emotional level that this movie just criminally lacks. And I think it is so telling. It is so telling that the one aspect of Kong that is so definitive, the fact that the sexual element, the element of him being a kind of being the tallest, darkest, leaning man in Hollywood, the idea that Kong himself is a kind of perverse, ironic sex symbol. It is so telling that that is an aspect that they decided to cut out of the movie to make him what of all things, another sexless superhero. Like, did you notice like the fact that like Kong is like yoked in this movie? Like, he looks like he's been lifting weights. He's totally bipedal. He's got huge triceps and shoulders and trapezius muscles. He's got at least like 4-pack abs at least. It's like, what is there like a giant Bowflex on this island? Like, what has he been doing? Like, so even Kong, just like R.S. Benedict has said, even King Kong, even the giant monkey, a creature who should have no reason to conform to like body beauty image standards, even he is now a victim of our pathological obsession with the cultivation of the body as a form to be exhibited on its own, rather than as like a living biological thing that is capable of basic intimacy.
Right.
Look, Kong Skull Island, I think at the end of the day, I have to say, still a good first time Saturday night movie if you're seeing it on the big screen. But I gotta say, at the end of the day, for what it's worth, utterly tedious and expendable. And that's the thing that's disappointing, because this is what is setting the trend for the movies to come. So we're going to come back in another week with Godzilla King of the Monsters, a movie that I needed no time to decide was an utter piece of crap with a terrible message and continues to perpetuate the exact kind of things that are wrong with American blockbuster filmmaking and making me pine even more for that one small Pyrrhic victory that we got with Godzilla. But all that in due time. Please join us next week on Monster Craze Memoirs.